Parallel to studying political science at Hebrew University, I studied English literature. And one of my professors was trying to teach us always to read the subtext. I think rabbis know how to do that also. And in reading the subtext, she was telling us, what did the author choose to omit from that text? So when you read the Oslo negotiations, they omitted any reference to the Arab citizens in Israel, which for us meant seek your destiny in Israel. You may think that you are part of the problem, part of the Israeli-Palestinian historic problem, but you're not part of the solution. You will be part of the state of Israel, and your dialogue regarding the Jewish and democratic nature of the state of Israel will be eternal dialogue. You will be an eternal minority in the state of Israel. And then the question comes, what is Jewish and what is democratic? So one of the Arab members of the Knesset says, Israel is actually Jewish towards the Arabs and democratic towards the Jews. And is this theme becoming stronger? In a way, it is. The ideological right-wing, ideological religious right-wing in Israel is trying to bring more weight of the Jewish religious identity, of giving it some kind of hierarchic status above the democratic nature of the state of Israel, which makes it much more complicated to figure out a proper civic relationship between the Arab citizens and the rest of the state of Israel. Now, another very short comment I want to make, and that's in reference to Ambassador Dayan. I share many of the moral values that you talked about. I do accept the notion that Jews did come home. No one is doing Jews any favor by accepting their living in the land of Palestine. And no one is doing Palestinians any favor in accepting their right to live in that area. The question is not living in the land or not. The question is within what kind of political structure. Is it going to be with a hierarchic structure, as many people are trying to create right now, using the force, using the military might of Israel to try to create that, which I think is against, one, the interests of the Palestinians clearly, and second, against the interest, I think, in my view, the Jews of Israel. The concept of winner, you said that the winner takes all. You referred this to Arab culture. I've never read it in Arabic. I've never seen it in Arabic, and if you can prove it to me, I'll be more than happy. It's a poker game. That comes from poker, and in Arab culture, we do not play poker.
I didn't say the words Arab culture. I didn't say that.
You said that we learned it from Arabs.
No, I said that the Arab strategy in the Six-Day War was a winner takes all. That's all I said.
So that's the next discussion. We'll go back to your text and we'll really analyze it. But if that's a notion that, no matter where did you bring it from, if that's the notion that now guides Israeli politicians, in my view, we're not going to go not to two-state solution, not to one-state solution. We're going to continue going into chaos, and that's where we're going into right now. I still think that the two-state solution is probably the most feasible and practical solution, but still I would say neither of these two states deserves an ethnic clean homeland. That's a racist concept. I do think that a future Israel state will continue to be as it is today, with a significant Arab minority, citizens of the state. And I do think that the future Palestinian state should allow, in its conception, a future significant Jewish states, Jewish citizens. But I would say that in order to do that, the minority needs to understand and accept the role of a minority also, and not just act in the same sense of superiority as the settlement movement is doing in the West Bank, saying that we're here to control the Palestinians despite the fact that we might be a future minority. If they would accept Palestinian sovereignty and the right of the majority to make decisions and disarm themselves, then I would be one of the people that will fight for future Jewish presence as a minority in a future Palestinian state.
Please, Kenneth.
Thank you. Nice to be here. Very briefly, It's not a great time for peacemaking. Probably the most hopeful regional issue that could potentially help the peacemaking process is that infamous Saudi-Israeli strategic alliance in light of Iran and all of that, which does have within it potential, if both sides would try to move it, to advance the peace process. But I would say that on both sides, on the Palestinian side, many of the things that Consul General Dayan talked about with regard to the Palestinians, I have to agree with. I still don't believe they've made the qualitative leap towards accepting the legitimacy of a Jewish state, issues of refugees, the denial. By the way, it wasn't only a recent thing, that the famous Camp David thing. It was a critical moment when Barak was offering to share the holy sites, in which a Palestinian delegate raised the question of the historicity of the Jewish connection to those sites. So that issue is very big, and there are many of those issues. On the other hand, these days, too often in Israel, we consider a success the prevention of those folks who want to make it impossible for a two-state solution to happen. I'm not saying that's the policy of the government, but too often the discussions are what can be done. Indeed, when Trump came to Israel after Naftali Bennett said the day after the election, that's the end of the two-state solution, it was considered a bit of a moderate success that he didn't talk in those terms. So I think we're in, the big distinction I like to make is the distinction between whom to blame, if you will, for the absence of peace and what to do about it. And there's always enough blame to go around to all sides, but I fall into the camp that probably at least 80% of the blame continues to fall on the Palestinians, as Consul General talked about. But then there's the question, what does Israel do in light of the fact that it still doesn't have a peace partner? And there I often contrast Sharon to Netanyahu, and I don't have to agree with everything Sharon did in the withdrawal from Gaza, and there are many questions. But I think what did happen is he exercised leadership, and he asked many of the right questions. What do you do when you don't have a partner for peace? Is it, do you just hunker down, or do you have to take some initiative? And I think that's something, that doesn't fall into the category of saying Israel's the party responsible for the absence of peace, which I think is absurd. But it does raise questions, what Israel ought to do, both from an internal perspective and an external perspective. Internally, when there's no movement within the country, that plays into the hands of exactly those who use a vacuum to try to prevent the opportunity from a Palestinian state ever happening. And so that vacuum in itself is destructive, and therefore I think there's internal value. And externally, I always think back to the first Intifada and the second Intifada. The first Intifada came during the Shamir government. The country was united for 6 months, and then the left turned against the government and basically said, what do you expect from the Palestinians? They're being offered nothing, and during that terrible time, Israel was a divided country, and it was reflected outside of Israel. During the second Intifada, which followed Ehud Barak's offer at Camp David, the country was united in a very terrible time, and that was a tremendous strength. The fact that Israel had clearly taken an initiative to offer the Palestinians a chance for a state meant that the left couldn't be critical. And I remember seeing articles, even someone like Tom Friedman said, you can't blame Israel this time. And I think, therefore, it had impact internally in Israel, but also had impact externally on the perception of whether Israel is serious about peace. Now, you could say that's always passing, they give Israel credit and then they go back, but that's still the challenge for Israel, to always be the party to demonstrate they're ready to take initiative. So while I agree really with what Ambassador Dayan said, in the sense of who's mainly responsible, that does not end the discussion. The discussion then, to me, becomes, okay, if we don't have peace, what is it that Israel can do, both from an internal perspective and from an external perspective?
Thank you. Thank you so much for that. I have to say, each of you obviously went past your 5 minutes, but besides for that, see now I'm standing, so I'm in charge. You went past your 5 minutes, but besides for that, the truth is you each said so much that we probably could talk to you about it for 45 minutes. And Ambassador Dayan, I want to thank you for being able to listen to people talk about your remarks without really being able to respond properly.
I'm the right to respond.
Maybe at the end. I'm serious. Maybe at the end, because I think there's something appropriate about having an appropriate response. But I would be remiss if I didn't pick up on a few threads that I heard here. I want to go to what you're talking about in terms of what should Israel do internally in the meantime. Because I find that actually on both sides, being able to say, well, the two-state solution is dead or it's not happening now is become somewhat of a fig leaf for not doing anything. And my question is not about national government. My question is about regional governments. My question is about regional leadership. My question is about NGOs. What do you think, and I'm actually going to start with Mohammad on this, because I want to start on the Palestinian side, which I think may turn into a conversation about Arab Israelis or Palestinian citizens of Israel as well. What do you think the role is of Arab Israeli leadership regionally, not grandstanding in the Knesset, but regionally in impacting this, and of NGOs and educational institutions of impacting this?
Well, thank you very much. My first comment before I started responding to Ambassador Dayan was actually dealing with this. I would say what we can do internally in Israel is go to square one. Let's prove that Jews and Arabs can live together. Can we prove it? Can we prove that coexistence works? That we can have a historic capacity to go beyond the 1948 and stop the argument whether it was Nakba or independence, or accept that it was both and move on to setting and creating a shared society. That's why I work for a center called Center for Shared Society. Let's prove it. Let's prove that Jewish and democratic can coexist together. And then the question is how? How do you pronounce and take this and to break it into real action? Can we, today, 92% of Israel is segregated Israel. 92% of Arab citizens live in separate Arab towns. If you want nicer words, it's separate Israel. 92% of the Arab citizens live in separate Arab towns. 92% of the Jews live in separate Jewish towns. 99.9% of the educational system in Israel is also separate, with both the majority of the Arabs and the majority of Jews happy about that. In my view, this was probably the origin of the biggest sin in 1948, or the biggest mistake, to maintain that kind of both geographic and educational separation. Because that produces, till today, is a reality that 65% of Jewish and Arab kids have racist views against each other. So how do you break this? I'll share with you one specific project out of maybe a list of 50 I've been involved in that tried to challenge this reality. In 2005, I approached the Ministry of Education with a project. I said to them, the separate educational system is there. There have been 6 wonderful integrated mixed schools in Israel, but there are only 6 out of 6,000. What do you do with the remaining 5,994? And my idea was, in America, in the 60s, you did the busing to try to force integration. Talk about busing today in Israel, they'll probably send you to a place called Shar Menashe, a mental hospital. Or you belong to hand-in-hand schools, which is 6 out of 6,000. So my idea of, instead of busing children, my proposal was, can we bus teachers? Can we have Jewish teachers teach in Arab schools and Arab teachers teach in Jewish schools? At the beginning, the Ministry of Education said no for Jewish teachers in Arab schools because of safety concerns, but we'll allow Arab teachers to teach in Jewish schools, Arabic language and culture. I said, that's fine, that's a political scientist in me. Take whatever you can. Pragmatism in the process. We started with 6 teachers, 6 Arab teachers teaching in Jewish schools. Today the program is operating in 558 Jewish schools. Now that's not what's important, not that 1,000% increase. What's important was that the impact of those teachers. A Jewish child that has an Arab teacher, after 2 years of interaction, their racism rate drops from 65% national average to somewhere around 10%. Why? We're able to humanize the Arab. We're able to create mutual interests. And we're able to allow even narrative debate where we can also identify disagreements. but at least we dropped the racism rate. And racism usually is delegitimization. What happens is the process of legitimization of the presence, of the interdependency, and of the norm that we live in and share the same space together. Finally, in 2014, I was able to convince the Ministry of Education to start the flip side of the program. Now the program is operating in 55 Arab schools. Next year it will be in September 1st. It will jump to 110 Arab schools. And the impact there, the pill against racism works as beautifully. And Jewish teacher in Arab school reduces racism rate among Arab kids from 57% national average among Arab kids, racism against Jews, to somewhere around 8% after 2 years. Again, what happens there? It's a humanization. It's breaking the walls of segregation. So I'm back to the point. What we need to, I think, square one, anyone that wants to work for peace, drop the capital P politics. Drop the capital P peace. Work for smaller pieces of peace. This is our capacity as civil society organizations. The big picture, in my view, it's not in our hands. Now, the political leaders in the Arab community, there was a poll also about 2 months ago. It showed that still 60% of Israeli Jews support a two-state solution. More or less 60% of Palestinians in the West Bank support a two-state solution, but 82% of the Arab citizens support a two-state solution. So if you would leave it to us, we'll probably figure out in 15 minutes what's the final status arrangement that will include both safety and security and sovereignty for both the Israeli Jewish state, meaning homeland for the Jewish people, as well as the Palestinian homeland for the Palestinian people.
Yeah, full transparency. I've sat on the executive committee of the Interagency Task Force for Equality for Israeli Arabs for the last 10 years, so I'm heavily involved in that issue and agree with a lot of what Mohammad said. I think that's important, everything you said. I still think the Palestinian issue, meaning the territories and all that, is a very different kind of issue. There are many in Israel, from the government's point of view, who are actually quite good, I think, on these kinds of issues, who may have very different views about the territories. And that leads me to an area that I think is a national issue, but one that could begin locally. And that's the question of the left in Israel beginning to persuade the Israeli public that they're serious about security matters. Because I think the last election was a real opportunity for that, and basically the Labour Party chose to run the election on domestic issues, where polls show that they were doing much better, and they ceded the field to the right on security issues. And it seems to me, if you're going to get ahead and present a more progressive agenda and a peace agenda, you have to win over the fears and anxieties of the public in Israel on security matters. I like what the IPF is doing in this area, developing a whole security agenda. But I think even on a local level, it should start locally, where people begin to have faith that the left can not only provide a moral social justice agenda on domestic issues, but actually protect the people of Israel from the very real concerns that they have. I was talking about the Six-Day War and the memories of those days. Yossi Klein Halevi has nicely put it about the May Israelis and the June Israelis. The May Israelis are the ones who remember that period leading up to the Six-Day War, those 3 weeks, where all the fears of another Holocaust, and they're still left with that as the major issue. And the June Israelis are the ones who remember the glorious victory and see how strong Israel is and feel Israel should be doing more. And the truth is, if you're going to make it politically, I think you really have to appeal to both. And so that's what I would start with, on those, even on the smallest levels of talking on the left about Israel's legitimate security concerns.
So I think we can move on. Okay, let's move on. So I actually would like to flip, I'd like to cross the ocean for a moment back here to North America. And I'd like to ask Rabbi Sattath specifically what you see in all of the hand-wringing. I mean, I don't know how many 50 years since 1967 symposia, discussions, closed-door sessions you've been invited to this year. But I can say that at Hartman, I feel like it's been the 50th year since 1967 for about 2 years now. And it doesn't get less complex, it only gets more complex. You're watching what's happening on our American scene. Our If Not Now, our APAC, our J Street, our Jewish Voices for Peace, you're watching it. Tell us if you think we're making a difference at all, who's doing something well, and what needs to be done better.
So I'm a BDS buff. I have to tell you, I am fascinated by the BDS movement. I have read all the protocols of the discussions of the Park Slope Co-op on BDS. I have probably hundreds of pages, and it fascinates me how American Jews who care so deeply about Israelis and Palestinians can spend so much time having so little impact. And I think that, especially among the young people, I'm seeing a dual narrative about Israel, right? So there's the Israel Hezbollah narrative. We don't have a partner. Israel, the IDF is the most moral army in the world. We heard it many times, and maybe a little bit of it here today. It can come in different forms. And the other is, there's a huge moral crisis in Israel, and our response is BDS. And I'm looking at my friends and colleagues here in the understanding that you have a unique role to play in setting the middle narrative. There's a huge moral crisis in Israel, and our response to it should be to engage more. And so I meet with many North American congregations, and there's some sort of two topics of discussion. One is the Jewish pluralism questions that center many times around who is a Jew, and then there's the Israel-Palestine questions. And I think that I would like to upgrade the who is a Jew narrative to the question that you brought up. What is Judaism? And what is the Judaism that plays in Israel? And what are the Jewish values that we express or deny when we're continuing a 50-year occupation, when we're discriminating against a minority that's 21% of our population? And so, from my experience working on religious freedoms in Israel, the North American Jewish community has immense power of influence when we are organized, when we're focused, when we have a specific goal. And nor but I said this morning, the Western Wall in Israel is the least likely place for religious pluralism to happen, and it's happened for many, many different reasons, but particularly because North American Jews have cared deeply about it and organized around it. And I'm looking at you in this, asking how will we organize to have more impact on issues that are of equality and justice in Israel?
I want to just add maybe a couple of comments in this regard. When you say what is Judaism, I ask what's Israelism. When you look at Israel and you look at Israel as a Jewish state, I'm sorry to say you are handicapped. Because you look at 80% of the state. Israel is not just a Jewish state. Israel is an Israeli state. And the question is, well, first of all, how do you educate yourself about the 100%? So put a different lens, instead of an 80% lens, put a 100% lens when you look at Israel, and interact with that 100%. But some very good, well-meaning Reform rabbis, or Orthodox rabbis, often would come and grant me this wonderful statement, say, the Torah teaches us to be kind to the goy amongst us. I'm not your goy. With all due respect, I'm not willing to play the role of the foreigner in your country. It is also my country. That's the Declaration of Independence, and that's the reference point for our relationship. It's not the Torah. That's the reference point for our relationship. It's not the Jewish nature of the state that is supposed to manage our relationship. It's the Declaration of Independence, and it's the 5 basic laws that guarantee individual rights and collective rights for Arab citizens, for any minority in a normal democratic state. Which means you need to outgrow your Judaism when you deal with Israel to focus on the Israeli nature of the state of Israel. You can't think of Israel in archaeological or archaic terms, or just from your own prism of ethnic religious identity, and try to enforce that, as some people, unfortunately, from the religious right in Israel trying to do, to say this is the term of reference of how minority status should be in Israel. And that's why I say, Israel needs to figure out its own identity even before or while it's trying to negotiate a final status agreement with the Palestinians. It's not either or, I agree. It's not either or, because these are, in my view, these are two separate problems, but one feeds into the other. If we are able to figure out the internal dynamics inside Israel, I think it will be easier for the rest of the Arab world to interact with Israel. Ambassador Dayan is right to say that the Arab world is refusing to accept a Jewish state. No one tells them what a Jewish state is. A Jewish state that has the Arab citizens as goyim, or a second-class sort of reflection or some kind of a shadow of Israeli identity, of Jewish identity. I'm not willing to accept that, and I don't think any Palestinian leader or an Arab leader or statesperson around the world should accept that. The democratic nature and the internal identity of the state of Israel needs to be figured first and foremost by the Jewish citizens only. By the Israeli citizens only. And the relationship with the Palestinians needs to be a territorial compromise between the two sides.
Can I just ask for a clarification? Oftentimes, Israel is the Jewish state by virtue of the law of return. Are you suggesting implicitly that the right of return is part of what makes Arab Israelis second-class citizens in Israel?
Absolutely not. Qadam versus the State of Israel ruling in March 2000 dealt with this issue. And Supreme Court Justice Aaron Barak said that there's one place that Israel is allowed to discriminate in, and that's in the law of return. Who can become a citizen of the State of Israel? But that is discrimination that Israel can tolerate and a democracy can tolerate, because it's discrimination not against citizens but against potential citizens, which every state does. It's discrimination against people who are not part of the club. Yes, that's a discrimination. And I'm not willing to accept it just because it is the way the system is. But I subscribe to what Ambassador Dayan said. I do not think that Jews coming back to Israel, to the land of Palestine, to the land of Israel, I don't think anyone is doing them a favor. And I'm willing to accept that as part of my cultural, civic, even Palestinian identity, and pay part of my taxes to absorb Jews to come and live in Israel, but to come and live with me as equals, not as supremacist Jews.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think these identity issues are profound and very difficult. We're not going to solve them here, even what constitutes Israel as a Jewish state. Having worked on these issues through the task force over many years, though, I have a mantra, which is, if we're going to succeed in creating greater equality for Israeli Arabs within Israeli society, we need to get the right on board. We need to do things that will help the right understand, because without the right, you can talk from here to if it's not, things won't happen. And therefore, those issues we can talk about forever, but I feel often that those conversations are the kinds of things that turn off the right and that get the right very scared and say, oh, they don't really want to talk about a Jewish state. They really, what the goal is. I'm not saying that's the intent, but that very often is the consequence. And therefore, to me, there are so many important issues in education and employment in society that we can make a lot of progress on, that I would really prefer to defer those kinds of questions. I'm not saying expect you to agree with me on that, but I just think there are so many areas where we can bring a consensus within Israel and get more action. I believe actually in terms of the funding and the budgeting that this government in Israel actually budgeted quite a bit of money for the Israeli Arab community. Whether it's been implemented is another question. But I think these issues of identity, they become a dead end, and I think very often they have negative consequences over preventing a lot of other issues that we can deal with more immediately from being dealt with. So I'm not necessarily disagreeing with you or agreeing. I'm not commenting on your ultimate question about what does it mean for Israel to be a Jewish state or an Israeli state or an equal state. I wasn't getting into that discussion with you. I was just talking about the tactic, if you will.
I think that there are two things here. One is the policies of some right-wing parties in Israel that have at least a stated zero tolerance to discrimination against individual Arabs. I think that's, for instance, what our justice minister says, but also zero tolerance policy towards expressions of Arab nationalism, which is part of what being an Arab is. And so that creates a false, in my eyes, a false sense of progress. And not that we shouldn't take the funding, because the funding is well deserved, but I think that's a problematic way to go forward. And in terms of where we are, I think that the occupation flourishes on the basis of the dehumanization of Palestinians. And that's why the humanization of both sides to both sides is crucial and critical here. And that's what we as a civil society can do, and that's what we must do at this stage where the political options seem so grim and limited.
Yeah, I just want to point out, just as someone listening to all of these wonderful voices as you are out here, how in some ways you are speaking the same language, the three of you, and in some ways you're speaking very different languages. In terms of the question of prioritization versus, this isn't the priority, it's a priority, it's not the priority, but pragmatism might be my first step. I think it's really important for us to notice that, because it doesn't speak to the fact that we have three people who are talking across each other. It speaks to the fact that you're each coming to this actually very typically from the organizations that you're with. Actually, you're really coming at this with using a different modality, and I think that's quite significant to just point out. I want to switch to another piece on the American scene, which is actually American Jews and American Muslims, because I think that it's quickly becoming a part of the story with the Linda Sarsour conversation. Quickly becoming a part of the story. And I think particularly, Kenneth, if you don't mind me asking you, I know that the Anti-Defamation League in particular is very involved in combating both Islamophobia and anti-Semitism, and at the same time we have this intersectionality row over the question of, can you be a Zionist and a feminist, or can you be truly for human rights and be a Zionist? If you could just reflect on, maybe not the inside scoop, but somewhat of the inside scoop of what the thinking is that's developing around that.
Well, you framed it well, that these are challenging issues for us. We're an organization that works to promote rights for minorities. We also are a big free speech organization, and yet on the other hand, we are an organization that stands up against, obviously, anti-Israel and extremist activity. So I actually have written a piece about how to deal with anti-Semitism when it comes from minority communities, which is really the issue. And what I really argue for is that, and just take, for example, some in the African American or Muslim communities, and I argue that we have agendas that we work on with these communities, whether it's African Americans, it's reform of prisons, or education equity, or police violence. And these are important issues for us, and we will continue to work on them because we believe it's right and important for society. However, if there's anti-Semitism or violence, such as when the Black Lives Matter, the platform came out on their platform, including accusing Israel of genocide, we should pull no punches and make it clear, because I don't think it's true to ourselves, and it's not good for them to think that these kind of activities or extremism are acceptable and part of a normal thing. It's not going to stop us from working on the issues that matter, but we're also not going to pull punches, and similarly with the Muslim community. And so that's the balance that we try to do. So in university setting, we, for example, when there's a BDS activity on campus, we don't say to a president of a university, ban the BDS thing. We believe in free speech and free expression. But we do say to presidents of university, use your bully pulpit to let it be known that while this can go on, this is what I think about it. I remember at Harvard in early on 2001, when Larry Summers, before he made his infamous comments about women in science, and he was actually doing well as president of Harvard, and there was a BDS campaign, and he actually gave a speech in which he said, not on my watch, any effort to compare democratic Israel to apartheid South Africa is anathema, and I'm just not going to accept it. And then he actually went on, interestingly, to discuss whether all those who engage in BDS activity are anti-Semitic. And he said, you know what, I'm sure some of them are, and he said, even those who are not, they create an environment that opens up. So the point is, I think we can have a principled and balanced approach, which is we stand for rights for all groups, and we will fight for those rights and actively work with, for example, the Muslim community against Islamophobia and against the variety of activities that hurt the community. On the other hand, we're not going to refrain from speaking the truth when we see things that are very troubling. I don't think that's an impossible situation to manage, and we have to be true to our principles on both sides of the ledge.
Unless Noah or Mohammad have something to add.
I just want to, so I think we're all doing the spiritual work of coming to terms with our situation and on both sides of the ocean and finding the silver linings. And I think that the rise of Islamophobia here and the rise of hate crimes and organized violence against Palestinians in Israel offer us an opportunity to think about the bridges we build between communities here and there. And also, it's so clear that the moderate voices are being drowned out by extremists, and the moderates have to organize and become more vocal and more prominent. And I think that that's a joint task that we can think about together and learn from each other in the different settings, and I think that that's important and an opportunity for us to seize.
I'll add one thing, maybe something that in the dynamics of civil society organizations in Israel that worked on Jewish-Arab relations in Israel, we've gone through three main stages. In the past, we used to talk about coexistence. How can Jews and Arabs coexist in Israel? And the industry that Givat Haviva was leading at the time was this encounters between Jewish and Arab youth. And it was creating this virtual equal space for a few hours or a few days, and then people go back to their separate and unequal realities. I call it the syndrome of the horse and rider coexistence, that you create a wonderful harmony for an hour or two during an exercise, and at the end of the day, one goes to the barn and eats hay, and one goes to his castle and eats a steak. That's why coexistence faced about 15 years ago a crisis where people didn't want to come to those kind of encounters because they do not change reality. It becomes some kind of a dialogue for the sake of dialogue. You enjoy it as it lasts. We started ridiculing our work by calling it hummus coexistence, or as you do in America, you fly kites and sing peace songs. So then the knee-jerk reaction was the narrative debate. Let's be honest, bring the elephant in the room, talk about the problems and so on. And at the end of those kind of sessions, we usually agree to disagree, respectfully agree to disagree. Each one of us will park their historic narrative, and we mark the differences, and we wrap it there. But what is developing over the last, I would say, 7-8 years, is some kind of a new maturity in our field, where we try to focus on trying to create mutual interests, trying to identify mutual interests and focus on them. So economic development and economic integration of the Arab citizens has become a key factor. So you see it reflected now at universities. About a decade, 15 years ago, the percentage of Arab students at universities was about 3.5%. Today it's 14-15%. The percentage of Arab doctors in hospitals was about 3-4%. Today it's 23%. And you see a lot of efforts to try to do economic integration, but also that's not enough. We need to do empowerment and economic cooperation, as you referred to, is going in the right place because it sits on that mutual interest matter, but we need to focus more on mutual interest in non-economic matters as well, including social, moral values that can become a mutual interest.
Okay, we're going to open up to the field here for questions. If people have a question, we'd love for you to bring it forward. I'm trying to look for all the hands before I call on any hands. Sir, please.
Perfect. The question's for you. Mohammad, you may not know this, but I just received a text. And it was from Bibi. Bibi saying, tell Mohammad, sorry, Ambassador, tell Mohammad he's appointing you to the negotiating team between Abbas and Israel. Is there some middle ground coming from your structure, from your history, that we're missing, we don't know about, and that Israel is approaching in the wrong sense, that can move the needle just a little bit?
First of all, I accept the appointment. I wonder what the fringe benefits that come with it. But I assume it's volunteer job.
It's for the whole life.
Yeah. I think that if the Arab citizens, and this really goes back to your question, if the Arab citizens would be more involved in the negotiations between Israel and the Palestinians, I think we'll be able to contribute a significant deal. Just look at what happened last week. A member of Knesset from Kulano, I forgot his name, a Druze member of Knesset, was commissioned by the finance minister to talk to Prime Minister Hamadallah from the Palestinian Authority. It resulted with a meeting between Kahlon and the Prime Minister of the Palestinian Authority, and they made a number of agreements of how to start easing some pressures in certain areas. If you go back to 1991, 1992, the key factor that was during the Prime Minister's office and Arafat's office was an Arab member of Knesset, he was not an Arab member of the Knesset at the time, it was Ahmad Tibi. He was doing this shuttle trips between Tunisia and Israel for many, many years. I don't think he's the most equipped and fit today to do that job, but there are many others that can do that, and mainly because I think one added value that we developed was our ability to understand the Jewish population in Israel and the Jewish people in general, and their right to be in the land of Palestine, but also their right to be a state. And that's something that the rest of the Palestinians do not know, have not appreciated, and we can help into this process. But I think on the other side, what we can bring to the Israeli side is the sense of the need for the Palestinian people to move to independence very quickly. I think many Israelis think that time plays for their benefit, which is true, but in the process, what is happening in the Palestinian community is deeper and deeper frustration that the solution is getting further away, that could ultimately lead to phenomena of complete disaster for the state of Israel. I think we are a very underused resource into the cross-border issue, and I hope we will get more used in this process.
Let's take a couple more questions. Yes, in the back.
Me? Okay. Yeah. I just had a question for Rabbi Sattath. Sorry for pronouncing your last name. Can you just clarify what you were saying about BDS? Because it was hard to understand whether you were talking about whether you think progressive support for BDS is unhelpful or what you were trying to say. Thanks.
So, thank you for allowing me to clarify. I think that BDS is unhelpful. I think that BDS is not moving us anywhere near where we want to be. I also think that focusing so much effort in opposing to BDS is unhelpful. I think that in general, I mentioned the Park Slope Co-op that sells 2 products from Israel. One of them is made in the village of Wachat al-Salam Neve Shalom, which is a joint Israeli Jewish-Arab village in Israel. So they had hundreds of people spend thousands of hours on this discussion, which is A, not known at all in Israel or Palestine. Nobody knows about it. And B, has 0 economic impact. And so, how do we harness these energies towards helping us build something helpful? So, on the one hand, I think that BDS is, I think that the Jewish culture is a culture of open dialogue, and I'm encouraging us to be in dialogue with people who advocate BDS and talk to them. I don't think that we should fear them, but I think that BDS is the wrong answer to this very important question. The right answer to this very important question is to engage and help in dialogue and finding a solution. So, does that clarify it?
So you know that you have a bit more time to talk to the panelists around the room in the next half hour, but I'd like to ask each of the panelists to just give us in one line. No, I'm serious this time. What motivates you here? What motivates you? What's in, as we would say, your kishkas? What's in your gut that you can leave people not only with the complexity, and not only with the difficulty, and not only with the pragmatism, but also with a little bit of the inspiration to continue to be aspirational, to continue to do this work, despite how difficult it clearly is.
I continue to care deeply about Israel and its well-being, both its security well-being and the possibilities of a 2-state solution down the road.
Well, I'm a bit more selfish. I have 4 kids that live there. And I always go back to 1948. What made my grandfather's generation decide to stay and become citizens of Israel? And it was not. He finished 4th grade. He's not educated with any serious education to analyze political scenes and to understand geopolitical situations. But he decided to stay. He thought that staying home in his homeland, despite the fact, Ambassador Dayan, that much of his land was stolen, and I do think that in this case there's some place that corrections need to be made. It doesn't mean that the nearby Jewish town that was built on that land needs to be removed, but certain justice has to be, at least individual justice, where certain lands of individuals were taken, that needs to be historically corrected. But I think that what leads me to say that, what led him to say that he's going to stay in order not to become a refugee in one of the neighboring Arab countries and then be counted as a 4th or 5th or 10th generation refugee afterwards. In my view, it's really my fear of what could happen. I wrote in 2001, and I wrote an article after the Second Intifada. There was a period I thought I should just stop this work for Jewish-Arab coexistence and so on. And I decided to resign. I came with a resignation letter to my boss, and I said, I'm leaving. And he said, take 2-3 days to think about it. The next 2-3 days, I went and witnessed encounters between Jewish and Arab youth. And I wrote an article 3 days afterwards that appeared in the Jerusalem Post. It was titled, you can Google it and find it, 200 Reasons to Go Back to Work Tomorrow. And these were the 200 kids that I witnessed, seeing that we can learn how to live together. We can do it. Kids can do it. My grandfather knew how to do it. And I think our generation is supposed to make it happen.
So I echo that. I think that what gives me hope is my colleagues and our clients who are Palestinian, who we work with seeing the relationships that we could build, and imagining what Israel would look like if those were the relationships. And that gives me great hope for our future.
Well, thank you so much to all of our panelists. You've given us a lot to think about.
I'm sorry, I didn't. The consul general wants to say something.